Welcome, everybody. Let me briefly introduce proceedings. Can you hear me? Yes. You can hear me at the back? Good. My name is David Goodhart. I head the demography unit here. But this event is not really about demography, although I suppose it touches on it. Everything touches on demography. This is the Brexit debate that we haven't really had yet. We've had a lot about Irish borders. We've had a lot about trade details, but I think we've had rather too little about growth models, about post-Brexit options, about the political economy of Brexit, really, which is what we're here to discuss today. And Chris Bickerton, to my right, has written this splendid paper on this subject, which does a little bit to redress the balance. Perhaps one might say a little bit late in the day, but that's not Chris's fault. As some of you, anyway, will be aware, Chris's argument, I mean, when people talk about kind of post-Brexit models, they tend to think of deregulate, the Singapore model and deregulation. But actually, Chris is a re-regulator of the left. And indeed, the sort of striking paradox of his argument is really that in order to have a modern European high investment in people economy, we have to leave the damn European Union. It is anyway, it is a rather delicious paradox, the argument, and we will have at least two people on the panel who are going to take issue with it. Martin Sandbu on the far right, who's a FT commentator, Nick Macpherson to his left, who is former Permanent Secretary of the Treasury, and Bridget Rosewell, sitting next to Chris, who is founder of Volterra and something to do with a bank. I can't remember what. You're a director of Atom Bank, I think is the correct. Anyway, Chris is going to talk for about 10 minutes on his thesis, and then the respondents will talk for rather less than that. And then perhaps we'll have a bit of a discussion amongst them and then amongst all of you. Thank you for coming on this lovely evening. I'm sure you haven't just come for the wonderful air conditioning in here, but it'll keep us all nice and cool, I hope. Okay, over to you, Chris.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much, David. So welcome to everybody. Thanks for coming this afternoon. Let me thank, first of all, Policy Exchange for making it possible to write this paper. I want to thank David particularly for all his support throughout this process. Thanks to John Mills, who made it financially possible and unfortunately can't be here this afternoon. Thanks to Graham Goodgin and Warwick Lightfoot for their responses to the paper, which come after my paper in the publication. And thanks everybody who's come on the panel to discuss this afternoon. Thanks to Nick, to Bridget, and to Martin. Let me just say a few words about where the inspiration for this paper came from. It really was frustrated by it was born by my frustration with something that David alluded to, which I thought of as the limitations of the Brexit debate. If you remember, at the time of the referendum result back in June 2016, there were quite a few speeches from very prominent policymakers, including our own Prime Minister, about the way in which the Brexit vote connected with something that had fundamentally gone wrong with the British economy and with the social contract that was associated with it. In her first speech as Prime Minister, Theresa May promised that Brexit would give those who are just about managing control, to give them back control in their lives. And I felt that since then, and particularly since the UK had triggered Article 50 and the negotiations began between the UK and the EU, the connection between those two things had been lost. Over the last 18 months or so, I can't see any positive economic strategy underpinning the UK government's negotiations with the European Union. The impression given overwhelmingly is that the UK government is between a rock and a hard place, between economic disaster and English nationalism. And so the negotiating goal must therefore be to try and preserve the status quo as much as possible. But it seemed to me that the 2016 vote had told us that the status quo was simply not working, at least not for a good number of people. And it's true, the UK economy faces very grave and historically low levels of productivity growth, low wage growth, this has stopped, a broken housing market where there's no longer any connection really between average earnings and house prices, and also an economy where regional disparities are so great that sometimes it's difficult to even think or even talk about the very idea of a national economy anymore. Now, I feel that the UK's negotiations with the EU should be underpinned by some sort of long-term economic strategy that's geared towards addressing those problems. And so the goal should be to change the British economy, not to try and keep it as it is and to preserve the status quo as much as possible. But obviously the question is, where does such a strategy come from? And to answer that, we have to have some sort of idea, some sort of framework for thinking about the British economy. And this is where this essay comes in. Now, before I get into the substance of the essay, let me say, and really let me stress, this is really intended as something to get a debate going. There's no sense in which I treat this as the final word or as a definitive answer to any of the questions that I pose. So what I do in the essay is I start by tracing out this British growth model. And looking at GDP by expenditure, I argue that in the UK, household spending is really dominant, more than business investment or net exports. And growth in consumption as a driver of growth was really very noticeable, above all in the 1990s, where it expanded at the expense of government spending. And then the relationship between consumption and government spending stabilised to some extent in the 2000s. Now, Colin Crouch called this consumption-driven growth model, he called this privatised Keynesianism, which is to say a system of demand-driven growth, but where the main driver is household spending rather than government spending. Now, this sort of consumption-driven growth model has become so important in the UK, I think, for a couple of reasons, partly to do with the scale of financial deregulation, and also to do with the role of rising house prices in financing new rounds of consumption. But this model has also really shaped the UK labour market. And this is a sign, I think, about how sustained patterns in aggregate demand can eventually spill over and start to reshape the supply side of an economy as well. And we've seen a hollowing out of the labour market with a vast expansion of low and unskilled labour alongside an expansion of very high-skilled labour, hollowing out this middle level of skills. Now, some of this is obviously exogenous to the British growth model. It's to do with technological change. But some of it is also endogenous to a growth model that sustains extremely high levels of demand for relatively low and unskilled labour in the service sector. Now, what I say in the essay is that 2016 was really a perfect storm for this growth model. After the economic crisis of 2018, the door to new entrants on this model was effectively shut by making it far harder to finance borrowing for house purchases. The house prices at the same time remained far in excess of average earnings. So what we've had over the last 10 years has been a simmering form of intergenerational warfare between the baby boomers and the millennials. And this has been exacerbated by very poor wage growth and the increasingly dualised labour market. Now this, as far as I can tell, is the broken British growth model. And this is the context for the Brexit vote of 2 years ago. Now, why has EU free movement been such an issue in the UK? There is a definite puzzle here, and I discussed this puzzle in the paper. EU free movement as an issue was a major factor behind the vote. That's not a controversial thing to say at all. But many, many studies suggest that there was no obvious downward pressure on wages due to EU immigration into the UK. So how do we reconcile these two findings? Now, it's become quite common to conclude, and many people have done so, that the answer is that the British working class is basically xenophobic, and that the Brexit vote had a powerful nativist character to it. I always found this puzzling because British politics in many ways stands out in Europe in that it's not had a solid radical right tradition in the manner of the Front National in France or the Lega in Italy, or now even the AfD in Germany. So what I argue in the paper is that EU free movement has been a problem in the UK because it's exacerbated the distributional unevenness and inequalities of this consumption-driven growth model. Now, what's the transition mechanism here if it's not wages? And it is, I think, in part wages, and we can discuss that. But if it's not principally wages, what is it? I think that the transition mechanism between free movement and bad outcomes for many people in the UK is through the impact on training and skill formation. The very high supply of labour has allowed employers to pursue what I call in the paper extensive growth strategies. That is to say, growth by expanding the labour force rather than investing in existing employees through training or by investing in capital. Now, over time, this form of extensive growth depresses, or certainly serves as a drag on productivity, and it sharpens very much the divide between high and low-skilled workers. So let me be extremely clear here, because this is the kind of thing that gets misunderstood. The UK's poor record on training is not caused by EU free movement. It's caused by one of the fundamental difficulties posed by training, which is effectively a collective good, and it's difficult to provide training through a voluntaristic reliance upon labour markets that are themselves based on wage labour. So this is a problem of collective good provision. Okay? It's a very general problem in capitalist economies. But free movement has made it almost impossible to overcome this general problem of collective good provision in the context of skills and training. So where do we go from here? I set out in the paper three very broad ideas, broad aims. The first one is to try and shift the economy away from this reliance on extensive growth strategies towards more reliance on intensive growth. Now this means rebalancing the British economy and rebalancing British growth away from its reliance upon household spending towards business investment and net exports. Now, some of this would require a change in the basic macroeconomic framework, which is very difficult because this is not a framework that is set by UK policymakers alone. And I discuss in the paper the importance of this broader macroeconomic framework in driving consumption-led growth. There is a place, I argue, for a depreciated, a weaker sterling, though on its own that would not have any rebalancing effect for the UK economy. We need an industrial policy that doesn't just focus on the very sexy, high-tech, innovative hubs which have been the subject of a number of industrial policies in the past, but on building domestic supply chains so that any gains from a weaker currency would not simply be lost by rising prices of components. Capital controls, I think, can ease the burden on sterling and can also help this rebalancing process by stopping the UK from being such a magnet for international capital flows. But I think we also need to focus on skills and training in fundamentally new ways. In the paper, I say we should introduce a statutory obligation on the part of employers to train their employees. We should create an institute of work, which would have as its mandate to investigate the complex relationship between skills and productivity, and that this sort of institute should have the kind of status and the kind of rank of the new research institutes that have been recently founded in the hard sciences. But we also need to transform what dominates our economy, which is the service sector. And in particular, I argue we should create a Royal College of Child and Adult Care, based on the model of the Royal College of Nursing, to raise the skill level and the status of these professions that we rely so much on, but pay people so little for. Another aim is to move away from what I call our asset-based society. Now, this is a society where wealth accrues through the ownership of assets rather than through wage income. Now, there's no doubt that this would be an incredibly difficult task, especially to wean the economy off its reliance upon the wealth effects of rising house prices. Some of this can come from building more houses, but that's by no means adequate or even necessarily very effective. We need to change the wider financial framework, which has encouraged the transformation of our homes from being places in which we just live to assets and investment vehicles. And the final thing, and this is what I'll end on, I argue in the paper, and this is the subtitle of the paper, that we need to create a new social settlement for the UK, one that is national in character and one that can create new ties between individuals, the market, and the state. Now, one of the key legacies of Thatcherism, in my view, is that this kind of settlement and these kinds of institutions that tie individuals and the state and the market together were overwhelmingly considered as simply selfish rent seekers. But in actual fact, without these kind of mediating links between individuals, markets, and the state, it's impossible for capitalist societies to overcome the collective goods provision problem that they struggle with. Capitalism needs these collective goods, such as training, as I said, or infrastructure, a number of others, but the market can't provide them because returns on them are immediately socialized. So in order to get over this problem, I don't think we should be reinventing the old corporatism of the post-1945 period. This kind of industrial relations doesn't map, I think, onto 21st century British society, but some sort of new social settlement is immediately and urgently needed. The final thing I'll say is that there are always limitations to what a paper like this can achieve. It's really intended to create some sort of debate. But any program for change is obviously going to create huge amounts of resistance. It would be naive to think that you can actually change the British economy without coming up against the power of entrenched interests. And the way the debate around the free movement of labour post-Brexit is evolving, I think, is a very good example of that. Faced with these interests, we need to build a political majority in favour of rebalancing the British growth model. And if we don't do that, then particular interests will always win out against the common good. But that's the task of politics, and that obviously goes well beyond the scope of this particular paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, let me ask Nick, as a former Treasury Permanent Secretary, to perhaps to some extent defend the British growth model.
It would be a pleasure. Interestingly, I don't think, I know this is anchored very much in the context of Britain leaving the European Union, although I come hot foot from the House of Lords where today there is a debate on Britain's approach to negotiating its exit from the European Union. And Michael Heseltine, as I left, was setting out very much the same arguments as you, that why people voted to leave was that living standards had not increased. And that then takes you very rapidly on to this issue of productivity and Britain's chronic addiction to consumption. And I agree with you. I think the British people are addicted to consumption. I think the politicians they elect are addicted to consumption. So both in the private and public sphere, at the margin, we consume too much and we don't invest enough. And my guess is actually if we'd been having this discussion any time in the last 80 years or so, we would have reached broadly similar conclusions. This isn't novel. It's not anything to do with leaving the European Union or the way the modern state has developed. In the interwar period, we had much the same problems. Now, the question is, how do we solve them? And in doing so, are we going to make things worse or better? I mean, part of me as a former Treasury official makes me, I'm very relieved that actually the government hasn't done very much for those just about managing since Mrs May was elected, because my guess is that for every sensible thing the government would have done, they'd have probably done about 2 stupid things. So insofar as the state is focused on Brexit, that's probably a good thing. Anyway, I'll just mention that in passing. But coming back to the policy solutions, you'll be astonished to hear some, I think probably I do subscribe to the Treasury view, which is fairly timeless, that devaluation never solved anything. So it is tempting. I mean, look, all governments claim they're going to rebalance the economy, and obviously devaluation is tempting. But this country, again, just as it's addicted to consumption, it really does like devaluing. And it's one of the biggest cons on the British people, because I think it may be something to do with being an island or something, but people just don't recognise that devaluation makes people unambiguously worse off. And it's happened over and over again. And if devaluation could sort of somehow result in sort of systemically different behaviour, then it might be worth contemplating. But look, we've done that experiment, and our response to the crisis was to devalue again. Our response to leaving the European Union has been to devalue. And actually, the economy doesn't seem to be terribly responsive. So I would argue against devaluation. Skills, every government since I can remember has published an industrial strategy. For some reason it's necessary to have an industrial strategy. I personally doubt that one needs one. I prefer to leave it broadly to the market. But even more importantly, they have a skills strategy. Usually this involves rearranging a few deck chairs, spending really quite large sums of money. And I mean, you did mention the transmission mechanism. And I think I'm totally supportive of most of your agenda in terms of improving the supply side. Yes, we really do want a better skills system. But every government, it doesn't matter what political side of the spectrum, has been committed to improving skills. I think actually for the top 25% of the population, we have a very good education system, but something has gone wrong. And I agree, a lot of this lies with employers. And I remember some sort of progressive idea. We had an exchange mechanism between the civil service and industry, and I spent the chief executive of Land Rover, Dr Ralph Speth, who recently got in the news actually, came to the Treasury and I think was very bored, but I had a fantastic day out at the Land Rover factory. And he, being a classic German, just was astonished at how poor skills provision was in the West Midlands, was determined that the Tata family should invest in this. And I think I'm in no doubt there's something which can be done, but every government says they'll do it. And it's not that somehow the bureaucracy is stopping them. They're trying their best, but it seems destined to fail. Just very briefly, because I think I'm up against time. The one thing I do, productivity fell because of the crisis. I think that's largely because it fell here more than elsewhere, although there've been downward pressures everywhere. What makes Britain different? I think we had a bigger financial sector, so I think that's got something to do with it. But I think investment is the other thing. So I think the government needs to invest more and consume less. I'd get rid of the triple lock. Where I do agree with you is very much we've got to address housing and property. Something went wrong in the 1980s. The domestic rates were a poor proxy for a property tax, but at least they were a proxy. Property, we tax transactions, which is incredibly inefficient and stupid, but we don't tax property. So we should follow Ireland's example, lower stamp duty rates and have a self-assessed property tax. And we need to build more housing. And I agree with you on planning, but again, every government says it's liberating planning. I've yet to see it making much difference.
Thank you, Nick. Bridget.
What remarkable agreement there is between you and Chris. But also, I think from your perspective, Nick, nothing can be done because where is the difference to be made? And it is, of course, precisely because people felt no difference was being made that they thought that bringing lawmaking back to the UK might give them more of an impact than they had previously been able to have. And remains to be seen whether that is entirely possible. But I think that I want to just mention three things where I think that we need actually to make a difference. And I'm not at all sure about the kind of policy recommendations, which, as you say, we've been trying this for the last 40, 50, 60, 70 years, and that hasn't made a difference. So why would it now? So what are the differences? Well, one is debt. So how are we going to get debt written off? So nobody's mentioned that so far, and it's, I think, part of the consequences of the way that EU settlement has evolved, and it's even more apparent in Greece after all. I mean, we were rich enough to get ourselves out of it. Greece has suffered very badly. Ireland managed to get itself out with some severe austerity and come through. But unless we actually think about what that debt means and the generational consequences that is happening, which then takes you straight into the housing market. I might even argue that one of the things that went wrong in the 80s is that we liberated the mortgage markets, on which my bank relies, and probably yours does too, Nick. But the consequence of that was to increase the amount of credit in the marketplace. And everybody, after all, is addicted to consumption. I mean, I think it's just bonkers to say that everybody, everywhere, wherever they are, would like to be able to consume more, to earn more, and to be better off. But if all of that earning gets then wrapped up into managing credit, then that becomes a significant problem. The second, so debt, I think, is one of the things that I think we should be talking about more. And we keep forgetting it. And we forget QE, and we forget all of the huge burdens that we are placing upon our subsequent generations, which brings you to the demographics question, not just intergenerational in the UK, but also I think that, and I agree very much with your analysis, that although people are apparently unable to find econometric implications of higher levels of immigration on wages, I think the dynamics of that are pretty obvious. And it is really interesting that now that companies are seeing, well, maybe this cheap labour isn't going to be here. Oh, perhaps I'm going to have to invest in some labour-saving technology. And it is already happening. It's already happening in some agriculture sectors. It's already happening in the logistics sectors, for example. It may come through into other sectors as well. So I cannot believe, and that is after all one of the reasons why people, quite naturally, if they weren't economists and they hadn't been overeducated, they saw consequences which the overeducated amongst us sometimes fail to get. So that demographics point is actually really important, and the idea that your children are not going to be as well off as you are or you have been is very powerful. So that's the second point. And the third thing that is devolution. Now obviously that's kind of a broader subject. It's both within the UK and outside it. So one of the reasons that I'm chair of a bank is that I did an economic review of the Northeast economy a few years back. And one of the things that we kind of concluded as a result of that review is that you needed more significant institutions in different regional economies to create the positive flywheel effect and to give people a sense that they were able to be in charge of their own destinies. So we thought, well, we'll start a bank. How hard can that be? Oh, well, that was 4 years ago, so it took 2 years to get through the regulatory hurdles and get the doors open and so on. But it is making a difference in the Northeast, because not just because of direct jobs, but because how it brings significant, not just significant numbers, not huge numbers of people, but the way that institutional feedback mechanism will help and will work over the longer term. These are not, after all, we didn't get here in the short term. We're not going to go into a different place in the short term. So I think that we've had too much reliance on centralised decision making, and to that extent, I think I rather disagree with you that we need cities, regions, which need to define themselves, incidentally, again, not to be defined by fiat from above, to be able to take charge of their own destiny, and to reverse some of the democratic deficit against which certainly my children voted when they voted for Brexit, and indeed so did I, so that we can create a sense in which, even if it goes wrong, at least you are in charge of it. And I certainly in most of I voted originally to join the EU back in the 70, whatever it was, because I thought that the people in the UK who were in charge were just awful, and maybe there would be some better lot out there. I was just wrong. So actually you have much more chance of having something which responds to you if it is close to you. And we've undermined that over the last, 100 years probably, since the decline of municipal socialism. And that is where we need to get back to, I think, alongside the more macro policies of thinking about how we actually bring down the burden of debt, where does debt forgiveness sit in some of these, in some of our policies, which of course most economists just have the heebie-jeebies when you talk about anything like that, but nonetheless it's been effective in various places. Incidentally, it is what's happening in Ireland. In Ireland, people don't pay their mortgages, and it's jolly difficult. I've sat on a board of a bank in Ireland, I know. It's almost impossible to get a foreclosure. So people just go on and living in their houses. So there is implicit, if not explicit, debt forgiveness, which I think is one of the, associated with some of the other things that they did, is one of the reasons why they managed to muddle through in a rather British way, I suppose. So those are the three things. We've got to sort out thinking about that intergenerational demographics. I do think immigration is a problem for lower paid and for investment and for productivity. and the devolution and the democratic deficit. All Ds.
Thank you. Thank you, Bridget. Martin.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I would like to start by just commending Chris's paper. I don't agree with it in its entirety, but I think that Chris has really identified a core problem. So I really urge you all to read it, and I just want to share some reflections on his main point about.
But by the way, sorry, could I just say it is, by the way, we don't have copies of it here right now, but it is on the website, so you can download it and read it there. Sorry to interrupt.
Improving their productivity because you do the printing.
Or you read on your screen.
Or read it.
So Chris talks about a number of elements of the British economic model. But I think the one I want to focus on is the labour market. And I think he's quite right in identifying the labour market as something that isn't functioning well. Probably some of the problems he identifies, the main finding or statement, which I agree with, is that it's a dual sort of labour market, one that has some very high skill, very high productive, high wage elements. But the salient bit is that you have a lot of businesses relying on an intensive use of low-paid, low-productivity labour, which in other countries would be a more capital-intensive sort of business. More people who aren't paid very well and do things that elsewhere would be done, things that would be done by machines elsewhere. That's a problem. On one reading of things, that is at the core of why the country voted to leave the European Union in the first place. In any case, it's something that needs to be fixed. My own view is that the ways of fixing it will be hard, but whatever ways there are to fix it have very little to do with membership or not of the EU. On the margin, leaving the EU could make it harder. I'll get to that at the end if there's time. But I want to make a few observations about the labour market problem that Chris has rightly identified. I forgot my notes, so I don't have the exact quote, but I wrote down a sentence from your paper. So you say in one place that free movement of labour clearly interacts with the British low-wage, low-productivity labour market model. And interacts is the right word. That's quite different from saying that it causes it or contributes to it, or elsewhere you say exacerbates, which I think is less well justified. And I'll tell you why. The reason is that the pool of large, almost limitless unskilled labour that British businesses certainly have access to until the country leaves the single market, every country and every business in the EU, and even in the EEA, has access to that. It's not accessible just by British firms. So German firms can access the same sort of labour. Any country in Europe can access that pool of labour. So it's difficult to argue that this accounts for the difference between the British labour market model and other countries' different labour market models. I think the country of Norway is an interesting counterexample. It's had as much, or maybe more actually, immigration from Eastern Europe per capita, and yet you haven't had this same either perception or reality of drag on wages at the lower end. And some of the things that they've done perfectly within single market rules is to enforce an effective minimum wage through universalizing collective bargaining outcomes, or use certification in some types of manual labor. Plumbing is kind of the quintessential case, where to be a plumber in Norway you need to fit certain criteria and be certified and so on. So it hasn't become any cheaper to get plumbing done in Norway after Poland joined the EU and the single market. But that also means that Norwegian plumbers don't have any reason to complain, even though there might be more plumbers in the country overall. So there are many reasons to think that there's something very sui generis here. Now, was it made worse? Whatever the causes of this choice of going with low-wage, low-productivity labor was it made worse by free movement of labor? I'll go as far as say that free movement of labor allowed those businesses to expand. And in the paper you say that they could have an extensive growth strategy, just doing more and more without improving the way they work, right? Improving their productivity. Fair enough. And that's just a flip side of many people coming to Britain to work. The work that they do, there's more of it. There's more hospitality services. There are more sandwich shops, all of these things that we know about. it doesn't follow from that if you hadn't had free movement, or if you end free movement, that you get an opposite effect as opposed to simply smaller sectors. Fewer sandwich shops, fewer hospitality services, but no change in the production model of those services. So I would like to put a warning out there. We shouldn't think that we can expect one benefit from a relatively hard form of Brexit, one that makes a significant difference to freedom of movement, to necessarily have these effects. I doubt it, and I'd be cautious about, you're not in the business of promising anything because you're not in charge, but that expectation may very well be frustrated in the absence of domestic policies that change the incentives for businesses. I think I'm already over my time, so I'm just going to stop there. But I think what we really need to focus on are what sort of domestic policies create those incentives. And it strikes me, this is a slight criticism, that in your paper, the recommendations bit, you actually sort of shy away from the kinds of things that would create direct incentives for businesses to shift into different production, for higher minimum wages, for example, much stricter rules on unpredictable shifts, or zero-hour contracts, that sort of thing. But one thing we know is that people with families who've grown up locally aren't necessarily able to have very unpredictable shifts at different times of day that you're told the day before or the morning of that you'll have to take, whereas people who come here without children to work hard for a few years can very well do that. So there are a lot of these things that I think need to be explored, and it is the case that it's a characteristic of the countries that have reasonably well-performing labor markets by your criteria, high wage, high productivity, are the ones that actually have quite intelligent but quite intrusive regulation of labor market practices, coupled with strategies to keep demand up and skills provision and so on, these difficult things. So I'll end there. I'll just sort of put down there that this is a very important analysis. I think it's one that would have been extremely important even if there had never been a Brexit referendum. I think that the Brexit negotiations on the whole are, maybe I exaggerate slightly, but neither here nor there when it comes to the ability to do this, unless it's that it changes the way we think about this politically, kind of creates a political space. Legally and economically, I don't think it makes a difference. It might just about make things worse, because the kind of jobs you like, I suppose, are high productivity manufacturing jobs, for example, that are high productivity because they're tied in with frictionless supply chains. So leaving the customs union and the single market would probably create fewer of those jobs and make things harder for that reason. So very good focus. You've identified the right problem. It's got nothing to do with the EU. That's my take.
Okay, now, Chris, perhaps you can just briefly respond to some of the points, and then we'll open it up. But actually, I would like to just jump in very briefly and defend Chris's use of the word exacerbate. I mean, of course, free movement did not create the British growth model. The British growth model, the modern British growth model, was created in the 1980s with the creation of this extraordinary job-creating flexible labour market. But it's precisely the combination of that pre-existing flexible labour market with the scale of free movement, particularly after 2004, and not just from Eastern and Central Europe, although initially from there. I mean, we had a huge wave from Southern Europe after 2011, 2012. And that labour was attracted here partly, well, we didn't have the 7-year delay, as many other big countries had, so we had a sort of head start. And people were attracted here for all sorts of reasons, to do with London and the English language, but mainly because it was so easy to get employment. The restrictions were so limited. And that was surely a huge magnet and has, you know, the British growth model is essentially a flexible labour market, very high labour market participation, topped up with high immigration. And the response of, you know, employers have had a free lunch over free movement, effectively. I mean, the falls in spending on training in the UK, according to Francis Green's UCL paper, is, well, anything between 15 and 30% since 2005. I mean, these are really quite extraordinary figures. And we've had whole sectors. I mean, the food manufacturing sector, you know, is 1/3 of employees come from Central and Eastern Europe. That's just since 2005. I mean, extraordinary changes that make a lot of, and this isn't just about wages. I think it's about feeling like you're a cog in the machine. You know, and you're not only, you know, for a start, you know, half the people in your class have perhaps gone to university and you haven't. You're someone who's staying behind and working in a local office or factory. And then you're kind of replaceable by somebody from Lithuania. When that sort of sense of alienation, that sense that national social contracts are no longer working for you, I think has been exacerbated by free movement. And the only way that you can, given the incentives for employers and governments, the only way in which you can, you know, significantly end the fact that 20% of our kids leave school essentially innumerate and illiterate, and end the lack of training in factories and offices up and down the country, is to end free movement. I mean, I can't see any other way of doing it. I mean, you need that kind of external shock. Otherwise, it is simply not going to happen. Anyway, sorry, I've abused my position.
So is that a statement about what British politicians are willing to do in terms of domestic policy?
Well,
or
I don't think the politicians
or
have
is what
to,
is economically
it's what, I mean, as the numbers...
The
well, I mean,
political economy. It's not just the politicians, and it's not just, it's the way that the whole thing interacts. But I think Chris was going to say something about it himself before we just jump in, perhaps.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the spirit was to have a debate on this more than anything else. So I'm very glad that that's what we're having. I would say that, I mean, I was struck by the information that's beginning to trickle through. If you see some of the work done by the Bank of England's, they call them their agents. They're sort of, you know, people in the field. The findings that they're starting to... Is that a bit better? It's too low. The findings that they're starting to report... Like that. The findings that they're starting to, you know, to report... you can't hear?
Yeah, do you want to come back up here?
Yeah, okay.
Is it not working, or just take it off and stick it close to your mouth? If you use it like
is this better? Yeah. Okay, so it's a distance problem. So the figures that the agents are starting to report out in the field is definitely the beginnings of a shift in this balance between capital and labour from the perspective of business. So a change in the incentives given what is perceived to be a tightening labour market. Now, it's not to say that there's some sort of amazing wave of automation that's out there and is about to happen, but there are things that are being tried now which simply weren't profitable in the past because of the access to a very extensive supply of relatively cheap and you know, less skilled or a bit more skilled labour. So there is an impact that's beginning to be felt. Now, what I found surprising is, one, how little reported this is. You really have to dig around the sort of the back pages of the Financial Times to find out sort of stories about this. It's published on the Bank of England's blog, which is a sort of very interesting place, but it's not front and centre in the news. But this is, you know, extremely important, and it goes back to this debate amongst economists. And there really was a great deal of consensus about the absence of downward pressure on wages. There wasn't any consensus about why there wasn't any downward pressure. There's a big debate about causality. But nevertheless, that was drawing people to the conclusion that it's just something about the nativist character of the working class that makes free movement such an issue. And I was never convinced by that. So I think, you know, whether we agree about sort of it exacerbating or interacting, there is a story to be told that is not one simply about cultural attitudes, xenophobic attitudes. There is a story to be told about the political economy of Britain that integrates the free movement with the wider British economy. Now, what I think is interesting is that this interaction between national growth models and the single market is by no means restricted to the UK. So if you were to look at the different growth models in other EU member states, you would find very different kinds of interaction depending on the kind of growth models that they have. So in the German case, the big issues that come up in Germany's relationship to the single market and to its Eurozone membership are not the same as the British ones, very different from the French. So in each of the cases, the national specificities matter. Now, I suppose where I differ maybe most with Martin is the conclusion that if the national specificities of the labour market are so important, then EU membership is neither here nor there, and you can change these things without having to change your membership. I'm not sure. I think in the case of free movement, we shall see, but it seems to me that that Brexit represents more than just an opportunity, but it represents a moment of change in British politics and society, and it's difficult to imagine that happening outside of this process of referendum, of debate, of surprise, of new majorities, of changing party political positions. All of this stuff is what's going on, and Brexit is not, incidental to that. It's very central to it. The one thing I would say, responding to, it was great to have a relative amount of sort of support on this paper, but there were some points of disagreement. On devolution, let me just say a little bit about that. So it's very fashionable, if you read some reports that are out at the moment about changing the British economy, to say something along the lines of too much centralised government policy, we need to devolve back to the more local level across the United Kingdom to use the power of devolved structures to transform the British economy. I have a huge amount of sympathy with that. As I said, this social settlement has to be rooted in the way the UK is today. The current relations that make up a British society, and we live in a country where devolution has happened and has fundamentally changed the United Kingdom. So that's very much the case. However, it seems to me incredibly naive to imagine that any sort of project that really tackles the entrenched interests that have been formed over the decades of this consumption-driven growth model can be tackled without the full force of sovereign power asserted over the private interests of markets. The title that came to mind was a book by Andrew Gamble, the political economist, called The Free Economy and the Strong State. And he was describing Thatcherism. The project of Thatcherism, the transformative project of Thatcherism, was very aware of the need to use the centralised power of the state. So I think that's my big caveat to devolution is, yes, more local power is important, but change will create huge amounts of resistance, and only really the executive authority of a government drawn from a majority in the House of Commons can combat that, I think.
Good. Well, why don't we, you can all, by the way, you three can sort of all have at least a final word in response to what Chris has just said. But let's take a few comments and questions. Can you just say who you are and then speak? Is it lady at the back?
Juliet Samuel at the Telegraph. I wondered, I guess, picking up on...
Please speak up a bit.
Picking up on some of what Martin said, I wondered two things about the new model you're describing, whether you think it's possible, because it's a slightly more German model, and I wonder whether you think that's possible to implement without, as Martin mentioned, the German restrictions on the labour market, on who can do what job, in quite an illiberal way that is quite a sort of insider-outsider model and could make it hard to integrate outsiders. And also the German union model, which is a very non-politicised worker representation, which is the opposite of what we have here. The legacy from the 70s being that unionization is incredibly political and difficult and not as focused on the well-being of a company or workers.
Okay, good. Well, let's take a few more. Paul?
Yes, Paul Ormerod.
Hold on.
I've actually read your paper, Chris, so as I enjoyed reading it. I'd like to make two comments, one of which is on about free movement, because there's not just a free movement of labour, there's a free movement of capital. And if we look at Germany, as soon as the Berlin Wall fell, the real wages of the bottom 50% of the German income distribution started to fall, because German companies either moved to Poland and Czechoslovakia, as it was now, Czech Republic, or they threatened to move. And so opening borders intensifies inequality. There's lots of evidence on that. So I agree with Chris on this. Where I rather disagree with, I was rather surprised reading his paper talking about a growth model, because one of the most well-established results in the whole of economics is that growth depends upon innovation. And what Chris is looking at is demand over the cycle. And he's talking about how the proceeds of growth, once generated, are divided. And just give one example. If we look since 2009, the trough of the recession, if we look across all the EU economies, the North American economies, Japan, and say, which is the economy where consumption has been the biggest share of the increase in GDP? And it is by far and away the United States, which remains the world's most successful and innovative economy. So the Americans had the sense to innovate and to consume the proceeds. There's nothing wrong with consuming the proceeds. Nothing is too good for the working class.
As you always say. Somebody else. Warwick?
Hi, Warwick Lightfoot. I work here at Policy Exchange, and I had
And
the
he
pleasure
contributed, by the way, to the...
of reading Chris's paper, and I greatly welcome it because it's very important that there's a broad political policy debate about economics, and it's not shut away in some recondite Nuffield seminar where they muddle up the mathematics. So I think it's a great paper. I disagree with a lot of it. First of all, I don't think there's a British growth model. What happened over the last 40 years is you saw two corrections of two big mid-20th century UK problems. One was the macro management problem of the post-war Keynesian legacy, where whichever way you went about doing macro policy, it was always too optimistic about what could be done and risked inflation. I think that the former Permanent Secretary is absolutely right about both the inflation and the descending exchange rate. And secondly, something that was done very early in the 20th century, the deformed labour market, because of the very extensive immunities, which slowly over time made it very, very difficult for the labour markets to function properly here. What you've now got is an economy that has labour markets and product markets that are flexible and can adjust to change and do adjust to change. If you've got a shock of more labour, you will find that people will use the labour and they will economise on investment because they adjust to changing circumstances. That is a desirable thing. You don't want to block the capacity of the economy to adjust to different circumstances. The other thing I would say is that we're very good now at focusing transfer payments on low-income households and households undergoing some difficulty, and therefore household incomes do really rather well. And we're doing rather better in other countries on household income and labour's share within national income because more people get jobs. They might not be ideal jobs, but you've got more players in a household contribute to a family income. So that's why our factor share has held up rather better, as the IMF has pointed out, than other places. In terms of the investment, I am very sceptical of being able to raise the share of investment within national income and getting a rate of return on it. Investment on its own is not worth having unless you get that rate of return, and that's the difficult thing. And I'd like to end by saying I think Bridget's absolutely right. There's a broad monetary policy set of issues that for 40 years, monetary policy, every time you've got a problem, you actually lend a hand and you wonder why prices of financial assets go up. And I think there's a whole framework of control there, and also the need for a wider range of financial institutions in the regions, and Ben Bernanke's work on that, and how when those collapsed during the Great Depression, you could put money into the system, but could a bank get it to local people who needed it?
Okay, so I think, what was there one, was there just behind? Did you want to have a word, or has it already been said?
So, Matt Thompson-Wider, just a much quicker question to Dr. Bickerton. What was your view of the industrial strategy? I noticed you didn't directly reference the latest one in your paper.
Okay, well, why don't we now perhaps starting with
Chris
you
first, because the questions were
well,
all for
well
him.
I want Chris to just sort of wrap it all up at the end. So you can answer, Chris, answer any of the questions that you fancy answering.
Not all of them.
A couple of minutes each.
Not
all
all
right?
of them were questions.
Do you want me to?
Do you want to go first, Martin?
I'll kind of pick up on what's been said about freedom of movement related things and come back to both Chris's response but also what you said. It's important here to distinguish between political psychology and economics and political economy. Clearly there is a story about how freedom of movement and immigration for work interacts with growth model. I don't dispute that, and in terms of political economy, a politician, a political leader and a policymaker has to take that into account when both presenting a policy and defending a policy for it to have political traction. But the economics and the political psychology aren't the same thing, right? And if it is the case that the economic mechanisms are somewhat different from what the political psychology would have you believe, then we need to be really alert to that, right? Because the risk is that we say, we stop inward migration, and wages will rise. And if that doesn't happen, that's another disappointment or perhaps a betrayal, right? There's been a lot of that. So this is why I want to be very cautious about accepting the story that just seems obvious on the ground. But to really answer, we kind of have to go into counterfactual history, right? So here are two attempts at counterfactual history. One is the idea that if there hadn't been all this immigration, then of course there would have been upward pressure on wages. Neither of you said that, but I think it was a little bit implied. Right? But the other possibility is that there would just have been less expansion, quantity expansion in hospitality industries or fruit production. So if 1/3 of the fruit pickers or the hospitality workers are EU migrants, that means that production is 50% more than it otherwise would be, and that might be the only difference. The production model might not have changed. There are just more people, so you can produce more with that same labor-intensive model. We need to think a bit harder before we jump to the conclusion that actually businesses would have seen incentives to start substituting machines for labor. That would have depended on, in particular, on the demand for the product. And there we have to take into account the demand effect of migration too. And it's not just that migrant labor spends money here, it's also that part of migration is very high-earning people. The sandwich shops in London, to a large extent, serve the financial industry indirectly. Right? There would have been fewer of them with less migration into very high-earning jobs. And we know that EU migrants, are good for the public finances compared to native workers, so that means that there's more public demand than there otherwise would be. Somehow that money would have to be
only the 15, not East and Central Europeans are kind of neutral.
Because they're positive.
No, they're not.
No, they are positive, but
they're neutral.
They are positive, but
they don't earn enough to pay enough in tax, and they get tax credits as well. But anyway,
well, I'll refer to Dustman et al. On this, but let's not get into the technical literature.
Well, I'm quoting from it as well.
But let's get to the other counterfactual I wanted to talk about. So it's quite right. Chris is right that you start to see at least anecdotal evidence, and the Bank of England's agents, probably more than anecdotal, or enough anecdotes that there's a pattern of people thinking about productivity-enhancing investments. Quite right. The other thing you will have read about in the back pages of the FT is that this has come after a very positive development for low wages that's been going on for some time. Wages at the very bottom have had strong growth. And this has come pretty much exactly at the time you would have expected it after the introduction of the domestic policy in George Osborne's last budget, the national living wage. So go back to 2015. George Osborne, I wrote a piece at the time, slightly tongue-in-cheek, saying that George Osborne had found his inner Scandinavian because he almost justified the national living wage by saying that this will incentivize businesses to increase productivity because they would otherwise have to pay more for labor. That is very much how the Nordic model has worked, pushing up wages at the low end, keeping them down at the top end through unions rather than minimum wages, but the effect has been capital substitution for labor and higher productivity as a result. So you have a bunch of confounding factors here. My vague sense, but maybe this is because I'm biased towards that conclusion, is that this started earlier than you would have expected just from the fall deceleration in migration you've had since the Brexit referendum. But, they would point in the same direction, so it's hard to know. But it's exactly what you would expect if my story is right, that if you push up minimum wages quite aggressively, if you also regulate the margins of flexibility that basically involve telling workers that you just have to be available at 6 hours notice, but there's no guarantee that you'll have any work. If you rein that in, that might also force other productivity enhancements, not necessarily machines, but just better planning. That's productivity too. So I think that there are there's a whole menu of policies that simply haven't been tried. Chris talked about sovereignty, and he has a very nice phrasing in the paper where he says, if I remember right, the exercise of sovereignty has been highly uneven. And I think that's the key. It's the exercise of sovereignty. Sovereignty has to be exercised for these purposes to have an effect. And my claim would simply be that the problem has been the lack of exercise of sovereignty that was always available, rather than some inability because of the EU to do these things. So my answer to both of you really is that there's so many things that haven't been tried, that could have been tried, that we can't say this is the only way. Unless it's in this political psychology sense, the only way the British political system is capable of pursuing radically different policies
External shock.
is because there's a shock that, economically speaking, has nothing to do with this, but it just changes the politics in a sort of unrelated way. But that's a very defeatist view of British politics, I would think.
Nick.
Look, I agree with Martin that membership of the European Union, freedom of movement, is neither here nor there when it comes to the challenges of getting more growth in this country. If we hadn't had freedom of movement, I think wages would have been slightly lower at the margin because the marginal worker would have been marginally less productive than those available through the bigger labour market. And would there be more investment in training or in productive capacity? I rather doubt it. So I think, look, but we will all have different views on that, and I think it's important just to get away from the European Union thing, which will take its course. Certainly speaking as a Treasury official, I can't remember, I mean, Bridget mentioned, getting our own, being able to create our own laws. I can't remember European law getting in the way of what government wanted to do, apart from in relation to state aid regime, and thank God for the state aid regime, because without it, I can guarantee a whole lot of completely pointless interventions by the state, which would have been inefficient and made the economy less productive. So, coming back to growth, I'm afraid demand management, picking up Warwick Lightfoot's point, I just think has remarkably little impact on the rate of growth. It does come back to the supply side. I agree with the point about innovation. You need innovation, competition, a more skilled workforce, decent infrastructure, and a tax system which at the margin encourages sensible decisions on investment in productive capacity rather than in property. So and actually if you look at most governments' growth strategies going back to the National Plan in 1965 through to endless industrial strategies which have been published about once every 2 years since, generally they've incorporated most of those things. And actually if you go back to the Macmillan report in the early 30s, the issue of banking support in the regions, the fact that we've got this extraordinary financial centre in London, but somehow none of that capital gets transmitted out around the country, the fact that our skills system is rotten, those would have been recurrent themes then. So I think you can forget about the European Union. These are fundamental to why Britain has been in relative economic decline since the 1840s. Doesn't mean you shouldn't tackle them. I think you should. And there will be someone out there who can come up with a perfect skills system. I mean, I'd love to think it's endogenous somehow, and if only you make labour a whole lot more expensive, things would get better. I doubt it. And by the way, just because raising the minimum wage a bit has worked so far, I would be very cautious about raising it too far too quickly. It will simply price a whole lot of unproductive people out of a job, unless you have a sensible tax credit system. But I worry about universal credit, which, unlike Gordon Brown's tax credits, at least made work different from welfare. And anyway, the government doesn't seem to be able to afford to put much money into them. So, look, I think you're right to focus on this. Look, we're leaving the European Union and it'll take its course. So it's more important than ever that we solve these age-old historic problems. We can't go back. We've got to move forward. But as I say, investment and skills are really important. And look, the cost of capital is relatively cheap. Certainly borrowing has been very cheap in recent years. I sometimes wonder, and I can't remember who made the point about the Bank of England and QE and all that. I certainly wouldn't write off debt. And the government certainly shouldn't, because actually the one reason why this government can borrow cheaply is because it doesn't default. And I think messing about with debt is really dangerous. But I do wonder whether QE The marginal benefits of QE, I think, have been incredibly limited. I think the Bank of England missed a trick quite early on in not tightening policy when it could, and this has resulted in a whole lot of unproductive businesses remaining in business, when in Schumpeterian way, if they had gone out of business, we actually might have more productive ones.
Bridget?
I absolutely agree about the point about not tightening soon enough, but there you go. I think that I'm not sure where this conversation is leaving us, because we all agree about things like the importance of skills, and we all agree that investment and innovation is good. You know, there's a whole series of tropes here which are which are easy to say, and we have no idea how to implement. And that is the political economy challenge. And I guess the reason why I'm going to come back to the devolution point, actually, is that I don't think that our existing sovereign state has shown the ability or willingness to be able to do the things that you say that they could do, certainly, but the political economy isn't really there. And so I think that it's almost like kind of back to basics or something. You know, it's how you grow stuff from the bottom up with the capacity to then test and try, to get some innovation, to fail when necessary, and to build that remodeling, if you like, because I just don't see that it will happen top down. It may not happen bottom up. Counterfactuals are wonderful things, and you know, in the days when I did scenarios and ran macroeconomic models, I could always get the results I wanted by, you know, moving on. Oh, but if we did that, then there'd be that policy, or it could happen like this way. And actually, you can never prove anything with any of these. Anyway, the data's pretty ropey as well. So it is much more about what we think that the political business economic process. Not that I want to go back to that corporate world. I lived that one. No, thank you. So that's why I think that it's got to be bottom up if it's going to happen at all.
Thank you. But I mean, just to very briefly take up we all agree on skills training, and yet, you know, we've just had an apprenticeship levy, which seems not to be working at all. I mean, we seem to, we've got, the adult skills budget continues to be
and there
cut.
have been, it doesn't go back just to the 1930s. I remember reading an 1880 report on the inadequacy of our skills education.
But why? I mean,
and yet we kind of muddled
who's drawing
through.
up who's drawing up the apprenticeship levy? I mean, why have they drawn up I mean, because it's quite a radical idea to actually. I mean, indeed, we are doing kind of one of the things that you call for in this report. I mean, we are in effect taxing.
And I think one of the reasons
but we're doing it very incompetently.
Because we then focus that on having skills as recognised by pieces of paper, whereas actually most of the skills that most of the people in this room have got, they've acquired by actually doing the job as well as that education. So we've kind of undermined the concept of apprenticeship, I suspect.
But I mean, wasn't the apprenticeship levy just going back to the past? It didn't work then, and it doesn't work now. And it's a bit like your proposal, one of the ones I'm afraid I didn't agree with, which is returning to a selective employment tax, which was another, intervention which didn't work.
Anyway, final word from you, Chris.
On the apprenticeship levy, you say it doesn't work. It depends who you are. If you're an MBA graduate who's had your time going back to school, as they put it, financed through this, then you've done rather well out of it.
But that's the point. I mean,
that's the same, but the point is that it wasn't intended to facilitate people to make their way through business school. It was attempted to help school leavers acquire skills in the form of apprenticeship. So it's clearly not, fit for purpose. But there is a sense of who benefits and who loses from all of this. And I think I would say two things. One is Paul Omrod made a really important point about the origins of growth and the way in which the proceeds of growth are distributed. I agree with you absolutely that these things are analytically distinct, but in practice there was a huge amount of sort of coming together. high levels of social inequality serves important headwinds to growth and influence the origins of growth process in terms of the way innovation takes place. And I think that's the state in which we're at currently in the United Kingdom, is that the coming apart, if you like, of the national economy, these important regional disparities, the intergenerational conflicts that have been simmering for a long time, the dysfunctionalities of the housing market, all of these things are building up as social pressures and are beginning to reshape the very way in which growth occurs and serve as important headwinds to it. So the two are interconnected, and one is serving as a check on the other. You talked about the US. Well, the US clearly is a system that, much in the UK, can be regarded as a broken growth model as well. However innovative and however rich a society it may be, it's clearly not working for many people, and that's being translated into its politics. So the final point that I would say is there is a sense in which we can find ourselves reinventing the wheel here and going back over decades and decades of attempts and policies to do this. I think that's where the politics is really important. This is about political economy. And I think the possibility to create political majorities drawn out of the way British society is currently constituted that are trying to do, and Martin's phrase was great, a whole menu of policies that haven't been tried. Well, some of them should be tried. And the question of why haven't we tried so far takes us back to the balance of power and the balance of interests across our current growth model. And Warwick is right to point out there are trade-offs. If we shift from one sort of growth model to the other, some people will not be happy. Other people will be doing a bit better. That's why it's political economy and not just a technical science of redistribution. So these conflicts have to be embraced, I think, in the name of change. But building some sort of consensus around the direction in which we want to go in, which is essentially a political task, I think is a precondition for doing anything that we've been talking about, and finally doing some of the things that have been spoken about for so long, but nobody's actually managed to put them into practice.
Well, thank you very much. I don't think we addressed Juliet's point about Germany. Well, probably lots of points we didn't really address fully, but it has been a very stimulating discussion, and perhaps we could continue the discussion over a glass of wine or not. Are there any bottles anywhere? There's one bottle. I'm sure we can find some more. But for people who do want to continue the discussion, anyway, can we all just say thank you to Chris and the panel?